whoever is making this reproductive print isn't necessarily the artist that made the original image. But it doesn't mean that the artist that is reproducing it is less of an artist. In fact, it might mean that they are more of an artist, because there's so many skills required in transforming liquid paint into a black and white mark on a white piece of paper that can travel all across the European continent.
This is Platemark. My name is Anne Shafer, and I am your host. You've reached us at Series 2 of Platemark, A History of Western Prints. Today we are continuing our discussion of reproductive prints. This is part 3 of 4. We, as you can guess, went on for too long, so I split this up with a 4th part. Platemark is a labor of love, and your support would make a world of difference and would be super meaningful. Go over to platemarkpodcast.com and hit the support and donate button. There you can choose between 2 options. One is a monthly supporting membership of $5, and the other is a one-time donation that you can self-determine. Also, there's a microphone on the website there. You can leave us a voicemail, ask us a question, or leave a comment. All of the images True and I talk about will be in the show notes, also over at platemarkpodcast.com. Okay, buckle up and here we go.
Welcome back, Platemark listeners. I'm here with...
Hello, True Ludwig.
We're back with more on reproductive prints. This is part 3.
Apparently, yes.
Apparently, yes.
Somehow we've managed to slather this topic across 3 things, and it probably won't be done until we're done.
Well,
in the 19th century.
That's because it's so intertwined with
everything.
Exactly.
Because I think trying to extract it from printmaking as a whole is a thorny issue. We've already talked about it being the controversy of it, but there are facets of it that, is it reproductive or is it just part and parcel of the whole reason for its being? So,
Okay, so we've talked for 2 hours. We got through...
I'm sorry.
I don't think anyone's complaining, frankly. We got up to Michelangelo, the Judgment of Paris, and its relationship to Manet's Déjeuner sous l'air.
Yay.
So we're going to pick up from there before we get going. We should do our thing, right?
Okay, let's thing do.
So we always want to do our positionality because it's only right.
Yes, indeed.
I identify as a cishet white woman, and I use the pronouns she, her.
I identify as a trans white gay male, and I use the pronouns he, him.
We are recording this in Baltimore, Maryland at the Purple Crayon Press.
Ta-da!
Ta-da!
You should really see how wonderful this place is. Anne has.
I have, yes, that's why we record here. There's prints everywhere, people.
Yes, and it's only getting worse. And, well...
It's not my fault.
Yes, it is. We went to the print fair again this year.
Yeah.
And I tried really hard to be really good, and it didn't go well.
I only bought one thing. Yeah, you didn't buy just one thing.
No.
No.
Nobody needs to know until they visit.
Okay.
Well, just the framers are happy. And it was worth every penny.
That's right, damn it.
Because we met new friends.
Well, and the print, as we like to say all the time, going to the print fair in New York is Mecca.
Yes, the nicest people on the face of the planet.
Exactly, and it was no less wonderful this year than ever before.
It is also the strangest, most widely diverse group of individuals on the face of the planet.
That's
From,
true.
Where in the ecosystem are you going to be? Are you a maker? Are you a shaker? Are you a impressive person who just seems to be really nice and wants to look at great art? Are you a curator? Who do you need to impress? Who don't you need to impress? Why are you trying to impress me? It's very different sorts of people.
Yeah.
Okay, there you have it.
Okay, all right.
Well,
Let's go.
Reproductive prints. Well, okay, so we had talked about many things about what a reproductive print is. Why, Anne, why don't you tell me what you think a reproductive print is?
A reproductive print is, start at the beginning. An artist creates a painting, a sculpture, a drawing, even a print, and subsequently another artist makes a print that is a copy after it to reproduce it so that you and I can see what that original thing looked like. And it can happen at the time. It can be
decades later. It could be hundreds of years
and it
later.
could be after the artist died, or the artist could have paid for the thing. So,
Absolutely.
right.
And you have to get past the thought that, but wait, aren't prints multiples? Doesn't that make them reproducible images? We're talking about the image, and I think many of the things that we talked about in our first episode or two was more about prints that were reproductions of other prints. And we had talked at first about the fact that our sense of what is reproductive and the concept of originality that we seem to cling to these days is very different from what the needs, the necessity, the interests of people that were grappling with an entirely new art form and what it could do and what was okay to do with it. I mean, who makes up the rules, right? So we had talked about, for instance, Israel Madnechenam, who had made about 600 engravings in his life, about 25% of which were his own original images. The other 3/4 were all reproductions of other artists' work. For instance, Van Mechenam did a beautiful copy of Martin Schongauer's Death of the Virgin. Sometimes you can tell that they're reproductions because there'll be mirror images. Sometimes they are almost line for line. We had talked about how Marcantonio Raimondi, I can't help but say it that way, sorry, Anne. Marcantonio Raimondi was doing copies after Albrecht Dürer's Death of the Virgin cycle, which was 20 woodcuts. But Marcantonio Raimondi was doing them in engraving, which is peculiar because different kinds of techniques have different audiences and different sensibilities, different chauvinisms, perhaps, because I have a tendency to think that most folks would have thought engravings would be superior to woodcuts. Woodcuts tended to be for those who had not quite as much money. A little simpler, a little broader, but you can't say that if you looked at an Albrecht Dürer.
That's true.
However, one of the things I wanted to bring up was this, just the concept of, let's say, Marcantonio Raimondi doing direct copies, essentially line for line as much as he could, copying a woodcut print, let's say, of the Presentation in the Temple, which we talked about last time, which is part of a woodcut cycle that Dürer did, and in it includes his insignia, his logo, his Albrecht Dürer on a little plaque. And Marcantonio Raimondi, this dude down in Venice, is making a copy line for line, and he includes the logo, and it says AD right on it, even though he, MR, didn't do that. But the thing that I started thinking about was, well, of course, Dürer was incensed, and we talked about how he went to the Venetian Senate and said, you've got to make him stop doing that. But there was no concept of copyright. There was really no concept of what originality was at the time. It was, there are these images, and we want to look at them. At the same time, I was looking at the comparison of the Dürer and the Marcantonio Raimondi, and it's really quite remarkable. And it made me think about the time Anne and I were in New York, and I was cold because I, of course, had either forgotten or lost my gloves, and bought this really great pair of 3N gloves on the street. It was very cagey because it was supposed to look like 3M, like Gore-Tex. Mm-hmm. And it literally did say 3N, So it's that kind of, that Raimondi, in theory, could have gotten as much money having people believe that it was an actual Dürer, when it in fact was his knockoff. And so that concept could be in there. So who assigns the value? Who assigns the price? Are you trying to bilk somebody? Are you just being an interesting person that thinks, here's a cool image and other people ought to know it? And at the end of the day, many of these artists were business people who were making images.
I had a thought about this while we were in between episodes, which was, I started last time to say that when I was talking to James Wen about his research into Israel and Mechenam,
Mm-hmm.
that part of his point was that copying was not only it wasn't thought of as copying. Because
Right.
if you were sitting in a monk's room and you were copying
In a scriptorium,
a manuscript, that's how you got it.
that's how you got it. Yep.
And if you were a student in Rembrandt's studio or somebody earlier, you copied the masters. So
And that's how you learned it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the whole idea is on shifting sands.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that is part of the big deal. But the other idea of a reproductive print could be that it doesn't have to copy with absolute fidelity. One of the things that we'll start discovering today is that a reproductive print could be somebody that's trying to copy that painting or that sculpture as directly as possible, or it could be that they make some pretty significant changes. It could be that they only zone in on a part of the composition. It could be that they alter it in some way. It could be that they are eliding two images by the same artist into a single image. So the idea would be whoever is making this reproductive print isn't necessarily the artist that made the original image. But it doesn't mean that the artist that is reproducing it is less of an artist. In fact, it might mean that they are more of an artist because there's so many skills required in transforming liquid paint into a black and white mark on a white piece of paper that can travel all across the European continent. So it is arbitrary in some respects to say it's a reproductive print and distinguish it from original printmaking. It can get very messy, and I think I threw in a couple things here today just to confound and annoy and see if we can do that. Because, you could say, are they appropriating? Are they collaborating? Are they copying? Are they stealing? Is it any of those things? Appropriation becomes something that's what you do in this postmodernist age, right? You appropriate, or you do a riff on something, you do a mashup. But it's very hard to judge and call out and then say, no more, cancel some of these printmakers because they were making reproductive prints. The concept of prints copying prints was something that, as we've shown, right around 1500 was becoming quite common. And then more and more, it was a way of prints copying paintings. And maybe it was just an opportunity, when we talk about Raphael, or Raphael particularly, who knew it to be a way to spread his fame. Albrecht Dürer, on the other hand, did not make prints after his own paintings. He kept them as very different worlds. However, if we were to look at, for instance, the devil in Night, Death, and the Devil, you can see that he actually had borrowed a motif from look like some Middle European guy.
What was that name again?
It's got a lot of vowels in it. He had borrowed this one motif, and it's interesting to go, oh yeah, the beasties and the snarling bits. If you were to look at the scary critters in the Schongau or Torment of St. Anthony and say, ooh, there's a piece of that, ooh, there's a piece of that, and it's 15th century Photoshop.
I feel like the Goonies and the Gremlins are all borrowed from everybody. Like
they're from everybody's bad nightmare dreams. So the concept, though, of reproducing images becomes ever more, it increases hundredfold, many-fold, more than hundredfold, let's say, in the first half of the 1500s. And it keeps pace with the innovations in art because there's so much happening. I can't imagine that it would be any different than how fast things are changing in our digital world. And then you start realizing you're carrying a computer around in your pocket and just what has become possible. I think the more that folks realized what could be accomplished in wood and in copper and in engraving and in marketing, I think it was such a whole new territory. Dürer, I think, was one of the single most adept, alert salespeople to understand that, I'm going to make an apocalypse because the world's going to end in 1500 anyway. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make these 15 images based on the last book of the Bible, and I'm not going to even put any of the Bible verses on the page where my image is. It's going to be bigger and the Bible verses go on the back. Yeah. And then I'll sell it, and you can buy them one at a time, or you can buy the whole set. That's brilliant.
It was brilliant.
So much so that, the world didn't end in 1500, and he could publish a second edition in 1511. That's an amazing thing, He's the Steve Jobs or the Bezos of his day.
So forward-looking.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Raphael was the big one who was really trumpeting his fame. Titian was another one who was really getting clever at how to reproduce his images and how to get his images out there. I mean, his fame was unbelievably huge because he could just roll his paintings up and send them off to any part of Europe, and all those different crowned heads, fell all over themselves and loved what he was doing.
Because he was painting on canvas and not panel.
Correct.
Or wall.
This is always the fun part when I teach art history. It's like, okay, so in Italy they're painting frescoes, and frescoes painted on a wall, and if you're in the north, they're going to paint on wood. But when you're in Venice, do you want to paint on soggy wood that's going to rot? Do you want to paint on walls that are going to disintegrate in water? Why no? But you're at the top of the Adriatic Sea, and you've got the strongest maritime trade in all of Europe, and there are these ships coming in and out of the harbor. Why, look, it's brilliant. And I think that kind of flexibility of thinking is also part of what it's delightful with that.
But don't you think that's the purview of artists?
Well, that's their job, yes. Yeah. Being an artist I have to tell my students, being an artist is your job, right? To figure out new solutions. And, now we're starting to call them creatives.
Oh, problem solvers?
Yeah, well, printmakers are problem solvers.
Absolutely.
Marianne totally said that. I just loved her for it when we were in St. Louis.
Very incentive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely every one of us. It's like, how do you make? That's an inventive way of being. So, it's Titian is hiring like Campagnola to work on his woodcuts, and Raphael is getting Raimondi working on his stuff. Reproductions of his work, is that's what he wants to have happen. But now we have to start thinking about other things that come cropping up across the landscape. And so I'm going to show Anne a slide that I invented for my students, because I don't think they realize what a big damn dealio it was when this thing was unearthed in Rome in 1506.
That was a big damn dealio.
What's that big damn dealio? I even have big red lettering on it. You should use this one for them.
The big red lettering says, "Breaking news, January 1506. Laocoon discovered in ruins near Rome."
Exclamation point, exclamation point. Yeah, but thinking about that, and apparently Michelangelo was present at part of the unearthing of it.
Really?
Yeah, and you'll see that it completely changes his work. So the Laocoon, now, well, indeed, because the sheer terror and the drama and the romance and the agony of this Hellenistic sculpture was a big deal. Now you see dates that slide all the way from 200 before the Common Era to 50 of the Common Era, and then there was the Hagisandros and the three long name guys that may have made it, or
yeah. Oh, they think they know.
Well, you just keep watching all the literature, and it's still bits and bats forward. Nevertheless, there was this thing that's discovered in the ruins near Rome, and it's 6 feet tall, and it's this Trojan priest who's being devoured by snakes because he's being punished, as are his sons, and it's this wrangling of snarling, snapping things, and the priest is in absolute agony in a kind of twisted, knotted turmoil that we've never seen before. And I think about how that must have been like landing on the moon or on Mars to the Renaissance artists of the day who had just figured out, hey, contrapposto. Hey, I'm standing with one leg bent. Hey, I'm just going to look into the distance, and I will understand that my body is all in rhythm with itself. And then you get this absolutely crazy IMAX of a sculpture. Even with parts of it broken off, it still had this unbelievable drama.
Do you think that back in 50 Common Era or before, or whenever the person who made this made it, that there were lots of other things being made like this, or do you think this was really an anomaly?
I don't think it's an anomaly. I think it was like mannerism. I think it was a mode of thinking, the hyper, we could call it romantic now. That's hyper emotional stuff, like the dying Gauls that come about at this time. There's the ones that look like they're breathing their last breath, and they're and it's incredibly dramatic. I actually loved those, and the dying Gaul. But to show the valor of the people that they were actually killing, and the strength of the people that they had bested as well. That emotionalism, I think, was like the Nikaea Samothrace falls in the same zone with that wet T-shirt contest of it all clinging to the body, and how the body is everything is said through the motion of the body, as opposed to the stasis of the body.
Right.
So when I say breaking news, what do you suppose is the first thing that somebody's going to need to do to get the word out?
Make a print.
Absolutely. So Marco Dente da Ravenna has done one of many, and this one apparently circulated more than most. It's interesting when
How do you know that?
Well, it's interesting to just say the literature says this is the one, this one's the truest. This one's interesting that Anne is going to show you folks. It's missing one entire arm. Then you have to get back to the thought of what is it, what's restoration, is that appropriate, did they find the arm later,
right,
and all of that stuff. However, the idea of an artist who has two switches, one is on and one is off, you have white, you have black. How do you encapsulate the reality of this writhing tangle of humans? And one of my favorite parts is where that snake is just about to bite his buttock, and the sons are completely entwined in all of that.
It's that now?
Well, there's one in the Vatican. There's one outside. There's one outside of Fontainebleau, because they're copies, of course. It's just fascinating. But to see this, all right. So we have a printmaker who's looking at Laocoon, and it's on its pedestal. And then what do you notice that Marco Dente da Ravenna had to do to jazz it up a little bit, or was it necessary?
Well, that's a good question. So he set the statue on a rather large pedestal with an inscription along the bottom there, but behind him is a Roman wall ruin thing with little sprouts of things growing out.
And some egg and dart molding too.
Oh yeah, what's that doing there?
Well, if you cover it up and you start thinking about what's he going to do with all that negative space,
Right.
He's got this copper plate that he has to address, and in one respect, perhaps the drama of putting that backdrop that's darker behind then gives a nice way to bounce off the light so that you can get more sense of the turmoil of the body.
It's so funny though, because I know and you know that he's reproducing a marble sculpture that in my 21st century eyes, having it be just a sculpture on a blank background is perfectly adequate.
Absolutely. And that is one of those things that we keep finding out, when we look at what our sensibilities are. For instance, when we would show the students an early state of a Braquemont portrait of the Goncourt to a later one, and they're like, oh, I like the earlier one because there's all kinds of negative space, which that horror vacui was much more the norm in earlier times. So, of course, it's all has to do with style. So I'm giving Anne the Marco Dente version, but then we also have a different one with a little bit more Beatrice, and here's a nice wide date, made circa 1520 to 1565. It's made in there somewhere.
Well, you know what happens, I don't know if I've ever told you this, but when you're in some places, other places don't, but some museums that I've worked in, if there's no date for a thing, you take the artist's life dates and you add 20 as though he couldn't have made it before they were 20.
Right.
And till the end of his life. So
Yeah.
it's 1520 to 1565.
Or you might get the flourished.
Well, no, I never use that.
You never used full.
No.
Well, then just don't you do it either.
No.
All right, now let's see what our little Nicolas Beatrice had done a little differently when he did his fix it up.
It's set against, well, he's got the arm. He's added an arm that isn't on it now.
At
Well,
all.
part of the arm.
It's not even close to what's on it now because it's doing some sort of stretched out fabric.
Right, it's got this.
Looks
yeah.
like actually, or is it a piece of snake? It
maybe.
almost looks like he's dragging the snake across his back like you
he's
would with
washing
a
it
yeah,
in the
exactly,
shower.
like with a towel, right? It's a little strange. The truth to the sun on the right hand side of the image is quite effective.
Good.
I think in his case he used a real neutral, horizontal lines background sort of a situation.
Yeah, it looks like he's against a wall.
But I'm having some real problems with his solutions on the musculature of the torso. That's really quite frank. It's terrifying.
Very weird.
If you take the time to look at some of these things, you're like, good Lord.
It doesn't look anything like the sculpture either.
Nope.
Like, I mean, he's getting at the shoulder pretty well, because the shoulder on the sculpture itself is pretty convincing. That he's got the vein that crosses in front
Yeah,
of the...
it's really stunning.
Yeah.
That super torque that you would see like in a
Right.
wrestling match kind of a
Right.
situation. Some of it is really quite remarkable, and some of
Yeah.
it is baffling. And I think part of
It
that...
lacks subtlety.
Well, that is another aspect of its time of its making, because what we also have...
Mannerism here?
Well, exactly.
Okay.
Because I'm going to be using the Leac one as a kind of a thorough note all the way through this chunk of history, because this was the breaking news and this print was traveling all over. And finally one side of my brain said to the other side of my brain, oh, that's why it became international mannerism. Derp!
Because it was traveling around like this.
And like this, in prints.
In prints.
Because... when you teach art history, you go, well, here's this really cool image by so-and-so and this, but how did all these folks get any clue of what these were? So that's something that we'll have to start to, oh, look, here's even a late one by William Blake, which is just way too cool. It's too cool, so you need to see that he had to put his little notations all the way around it. It's just stunning, really.
Yeah.
And odd, and
So weird.
but, imagine this is a Martian. This is a being from another planet. Now I'm showing Anne the difference between Michelangelo's David, which he finished about 1501, and the Laocoon, which was unearthed in 1506. And then I'm showing her two images of the bound slaves, which were created by Michelangelo. They were supposed to be one of the 40 figures that would have adorned, 40 figures that would have adorned Pope Julius II's tomb.
The tomb, right.
Well, Julius, was the guy that had hired Mike to do the ceiling, but Michelangelo really wanted to carve. But what I'm showing you here is, it's point A. We stopped here. There's the Laocoon, and we got to point B, and it's like you can see all of a sudden, all the torque, all the twist, and the agonized face of this encaged soul that Michelangelo has now managed to unearth from the stone.
Yeah.
such a huge shift in his work. I mean, we all know the David. Everybody knows that perfectly wonderful.
Placid.
Particularly
since he's about to go into battle.
I don't think he's placid. I think that he's poised and ready. But he could hold that position forever.
Right.
Because he's yes, it's contrapposto. He's got, weight on one leg and a relaxed other leg, but that stasis would be there. That's the part of that Renaissance calm. But this twisting and roiling and all of the agonized movement from the Laocoon is something that we start seeing leak over into Michelangelo's work right away. And the next thing I'm showing, Anne, is the Moses, which he had carved for the tomb of Pope Julius II. And, well, I think there's a comparable link there. What do you think, Miss Anne?
The Moses, well, he's got the horns.
Well, of course he's got the horns. That's because he's Moses.
Right.
We've already mentioned to them why Moses has horns, right?
Okay, why do you have horns?
Well, because it was a mistranslation
That's
of the...
right.
Okay, because he comes down from Mount Sinai and there's an emanation from his head.
Oh, and the horns.
But it's like emanation...
Right.
Well, what's an emanation? Well, it's something that sticks out of his head. Okay, it's horns. And then once somebody does it, we got to just keep making him with horns because that's what Moses wears.
That is funny.
It is pretty funny.
The funny thing about this is that, he's a little bit twisted, but not totally twisted. And he's sitting, but it still looks like it's twisted in an action.
Absolutely.
Even
Because
though it's not really.
Well, it is and it isn't, because that beard is as sinuous as the snake's.
Right.
And that coiled activity, everything about him is starting to rotate away in this absolute indignance. Even the fabric that's wrapped around his legs has got this same kind of potential, and this is the literature would say it's like he's a coiled spring about to erupt, but he is, he's got the tablets and he's about ready to smash them and say, you idolatrous assholes, well, maybe I won't say that last word, but that indignation is so manifest as compared to David, like, look, there's a giant that wants to kill my people.
Yeah, he doesn't express much emotion about the whole situation, but Moses certainly does.
Moses supposes his toes are roses. Yeah, but there's 13 years between these two, and the Laocoon is one of those big moments. We have artists at their highest point in Raphael, Michelangelo, Donatello's dead, and Leonardo, but it all really comes to a crashing halt in 1527, and it's I don't think my students, I try to impose on them how insanely difficult this must have been. Because, maybe I could actually just read this passage if it's okay with you. It's a great passage. They wept a lot. All of us are rich. That was how one of the participants summed up the events of May 1527, when a mutinous army under the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V savaged the city of Rome. The imperial troops were fresh off a campaign against the League of Cognac, with whom Pope Clement VII was allied, but they hadn't been paid in months. To keep them on the march, their commander, the Duke of Bourbon, had promised them a chance to plunder Rome. The impoverished soldiers arrived on May 6th and launched an assault. The Duke was killed during the fighting, but his men breached the defensive walls and poured into the city. The Vatican Swiss Guard were all but annihilated during a famous last stand near St. Peter's Basilica. Pope Clement, meanwhile, was forced to escape via a secret tunnel and barricaded himself in the impregnable Castle San Angelo. I'm just thinking about this riotous, mutinous group of people who descend on the capital city on the 6th of a month and think about how they're just savaging the city, and I just wonder if history repeats itself at all. I wonder. Once inside Rome, the leaderless army devolved into a bloodthirsty mob. Buildings were looted and burned. Men and children were tortured and killed, and women, even Catholic nuns, were raped or auctioned off at public markets. By the time the imperial army finally left the city, Rome was stripped bare, and half of its 55,000 inhabitants were either dead or homeless. The cultural blow was equally severe. Scores of artists had been killed, and many priceless artworks were destroyed or missing. Some scholars have since used the 1527 sacking as the official end date of the Italian Renaissance. If you think about, well, for one thing, Rome is 55,000 inhabitants. Rome's not that big, but they devastated it. The literature will talk about a 6-month orgy of looting and pillaging and just destroying the city.
Well, that's what, can you imagine the January 6th?
Had it continued?
Continued for 6 months. That's insane.
6 months, right. And we lost 5 in, a day?
Right.
And so, had that been able to squirt out into the city, of course, that's the kind of thing, that anarchic, and being given privilege to do so by another ruler.
Right.
I just think that the more we learn, the more we forget. It's already been done before. Right. But the concept of the fact that the Pope is in prison and that the troops the barracks are in the Sistine Chapel. They're bedding down in the Sistine Chapel, and they're using St. Peter's itself, the great new church that Julius has been building, as a stable. That's debasing. And part of this, let's think about it, is because it's Charles V who is the king of Spain, the most Catholic of countries. And why? Because Rome has gotten far too, secular, and they're not doing things as Catholic as they should. He's supposed to be cleaning it up. Well, that concept, though, is something that I want to bring to the fore because, when we think about the Sistine ceiling and we think about how it's the redemption of humankind.
What were the years of this?
1508 to 1512.
Wow.
All right, you got 300 plus figures. He does it in 4 years. Michelangelo hates to collaborate with anyone. Did he paint it all by himself? Well, doesn't matter. It got done.
Yes.
But and he even figured out a way to put up scaffolding that wouldn't puncture his frescoes. I mean, all of it was really brilliant. But it was also human beings at their best, being redeemed. The human body is this field of joy, of redemption, and it's just a stunning essay on who we are. Now we have an altar wall of the very same chapel, and the newest pope has said, you know what? I kind of want that altar wall repainted. And so he asked Michelangelo to do so.
What was on it?
Nothing.
Oh.
It was just another, some more smaller paintings. It wasn't, it wasn't anything big, but he says, I want a Last Judgment. And so here's Michelangelo, it's 1536. He's working on it for maybe 5 years. But the issue here is that Michelangelo is not in his early 30s anymore. He's a guy of 60 or in his early 60s. And he's watched the world go batshit crazy. And it is the end of time. And when I talk to my students about it, I kind of set this up and I make them look at this image. And then I ask them, do you see anything as you're looking at this image? And I'm looking at Anne, I'm saying, do you see anything that's sneaking out at you?
Oh, well, I can't see it. Hold on. I gotta move over.
You gotta move over. You have to put on your glasses.
I know, but hold on. I haven't looked at this in years.
Exactly. Soften your gaze a little bit. Just soften your gaze and quit looking for details. And just sort of let this thing percolate.
Is it a giant skull?
Yes.
It's a big skull. What the hell?
Like, it's one of the things that you don't realize. Oh, he's positioned the figures, and up in the rondel at the top where there are arches, those become the eyes, and Christ is essentially the nose of this death's head, and then their teeth that are just created above where the dead are being pulled from their tombs. It is a Last Judgment, but it is the world gone mad. And it is a 60-year-old man who is really wrestling with this very difficult issue. That's not an accident. There's no way that's an accident. But the idea of the Last Judgment, with Christ being the centerpiece of all of this, and the good are being pulled from their tombs and raised into heaven, and the bad are being damned into hell on the left hand, the sinister side of Christ, the sinistre, going to hell on the left hand side and being gobbled up by the maw of hell, is an important aspect of this. And how is he getting that across to you? What's giving it its energy or its pulse?
Well, the striations of people, I think it's the people in the second level who are floating. Yeah. Mm-hmm. They're clearly in motion, and that totally comes across.
All of it's in motion, and then you start to realize that it is this huge stirred pot. Oh, yeah. You can almost take a big paddle and stir it from the center outward. If it's either centripetal or centrifugal, but it is all stemming from Christ, and it is in this constant motion. And you're inevitably dumped down into hell, right. And as you face this wall, there are two doorways, right. And it's like, well, are you going to go out under the door of the good side or the door every day you go out into the world is a choice. And Michelangelo gave you all of this. Well, it's a 60-year-old man who's doing this, and by the way, he even takes on somebody that he was the master of ceremonies,
right.
who had given Michelangelo a bunch of crap for having painted a bunch of nude figures. So down in the corner, I love the fact that Michelangelo has a sense of humor. He's got this character with ears of a an ass. He's got a snake wrapped around him like the Laocoon, and the snake is biting him on his bell end. Yes. So, and there he is, just, but good old Mike. But so, of course, how do we get the word out there? Prance. And so, no sooner said than done. It's interesting to think about what it must have been like for artists to go, well, how do I capture this image? It's like 60 feet tall, and it's a fresco, and yet by the time this has gone out there, Michelangelo is a household word, essentially. I mean, north and south of the Alps. So in this particular reproduction, we're seeing one by Giulio Bonassone, and this was done, this one's at the Met, and it's done in middle of the 15th century. You get one take on it, and it looks like he's giving you the data, the figures, the issues of, I think he's trying to give you a map of the composition.
Yeah. He doesn't, maybe it's the impression, but the lack of the range of black to
there you go.
White is too middle zone.
Right. Now, if I'm remembering correctly, this is based on, the chalk drawing that he had done when he was standing there.
Oh.
So already...
Bonassone stood there.
And did his black and white chalk drawing. So it's already essentially a Xerox of a Xerox, right? Because he's had to commit what he's seeing in color, made it smaller, done it in a line sketch, and then that sketch has to become an engraving. So that's one take on it. And I think he's giving us, okay, this is where all the figures are. That's what I see on the wall. But then let's take a look at a different one that was made by Martin Rota. And it's an Italian artist, and it's done about 1569. And it's so fun. You should see Anne's eyebrows go down. And so now it's still the same painting, or is it?
Jesus. What the hell is happening?
Well, it's still got the same roundy.
I know, but look at the portrait up in the middle.
You never know if you're going to need to put a portrait of somebody up there. So let's just add that.
That's so bizarre.
Now, is it reproducing the image? Yes and no.
There's a weird radiating light around the central grouping that makes it look like a insert, like a cutout, something. That's
you mean like buy now, last 6 days before the sale ends kind of thing?
Maybe.
It is. It's wow.
And in the strata of people, like on the bottom, it's falling apart because the people are dripping down into the earthly realm there's less of a demarcation between the two.
Yeah, it's just, it certainly tells you that Michelangelo could really organize things effectively. Right. So he's got them now. But he's got them all sounding trumpets and doing their thing. But you can see that the artist, as in Martin Rota, has expanded on some of the vocabulary that's being offered there. But then let's talk about this one. We've talked about this fellow before, Giorgio Ghisi.
Oh, right.
Well, now Ghisi also gives us a reproductive print, and he's doing this about 1545, and it is in fact an engraving in 3 plates. But what has he decided to do?
Well, because he did it on 3 plates, he didn't want to split up the central grouping on 2 different plates, so he's skewed it to the right.
He's zeroing in on some certain bits.
Can be on one single plate.
Or one single image, but we don't need. I think it gets across the concept of how much is there and the roiling figures. I think that I'm far more apt to be able to understand the absolute livid anger of Christ, swatting down the evils of the world, and looking at how his mother, the Virgin Mary, is shrinking like, oh no, it's going to get very bad, and all the heavenly elect are going up into the heavens. I feel as though Ghisi has given us a truer representation of what Michelangelo was giving us in the actual fresco in terms of the values and the volumes of the bodies.
Well, and how much do you need to say the thing?
Right. Do you have to say everything? Less is more.
You don't need 400 people to say you're going to go to hell.
No, and I think in this case, it becomes really obvious. And of course, the other most important thing, I think, is that he does show what's the thing that really points downward in this image. This is great.
The flayed skin of somebody.
Yes. Now this is Saint Bartholomew, he's holding the implement of his martyrdom. He was skinned alive.
Right.
Well, this is the part that I love to tell my students about because he's holding his own flayed skin, and on the flayed skin is Michelangelo's self-portrait.
What?
Absolutely.
No.
Yes. Absolutely. You can look at that and you'll look at images and you're like, son of a bitch, he signed it. And it is this ghoulish face. Whoa. It's like he himself is melting, as though the world has gone absolutely daft. Because this is a time after the sack of Rome when the Catholic Church the foundations of the Church of Christendom has been shaken so badly. How are we going to get our act back together? And I think that the negative, I hate to say vibe, just the overall negativity of what this last judgment is and how perilous it is really given. I think Giorgio Ghisi gives us a better sense of this.
Well, he's editing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What do you need to get the point across?
Right.
Just like I'm editing and saying, well, we're not going to talk about a bunch of people in North. We're not going to. This is our history of prints. It's a history of prints. So we have to focus on a few things. And I think it's interesting to use this example because this is an image after Michelangelo. And remembering that Giorgio Ghisi is one of those fellows that runs up north and he starts working for, Hieronymus in Antwerp and starting one of the largest reproductive print houses in all of Europe, right?
Four Winds?
Yes, very good.
Thanks
You've
so
been
much.
paying attention.
I have.
And the other big gang is up there in Haarlem, where Colcius is hanging out. So, if you think about, here's an artist translating the South to the North, what do we need? Now, one more, because it is fascinating, is somebody else who zeroed in even tighter on a group, and this is by Domenico del Barbiere, and he's like really taking it down. He's like, I'm just going to pay attention to a certain group.
Yeah, that's a great print.
It is. Why did you say this is a great print? Why?
Well, to my modern sensibility, he's left a lot of negative space so that it looks almost unfinished, but it is helping you zero in on the important features.
And again, how much do you need to get the story across? Now, in this case, he's playing with the light and the dark and the pushing the light and shadow so much more effectively when he's letting us see the darkness that's behind, I believe this is St. Peter. When you see that how he's really managing to get the sense of light and shadow that wraps around the bodies. How this is a sculptor's drawing. When you can look at something and say, that's a sculptor's drawing. But if we go back to the first one, we go, well, that's somebody that was drawing a diagram of a painting.
Right.
And
the
the bonusone. And then you get, well, okay, then they're going to have the glowy glowy. And then you've got, okay, Ghisi, I'm pretty pleased with that. But when I look at the values of what Barbiere has done, I'm most impressed because I feel as though he's channeled Michelangelo's sense of the figure the most adeptly.
Yeah.
And for our money, I think it's almost better than non finito. That was one of the aspects of Michelangelo's carved work.
That's true.
So it's almost as though this reproductive printmaker seems to understand the man and what he's after, the artist and what he's after, more so than the ones that gave us all the whistles and bells.
Okay, so 2 questions. One, how long after did Barbiere do this after Michelangelo died? Let's see.
Well, this is one of those famous ones, ND.
No date. Oh, God dang it. Okay.
But it can't be that far later.
Right, so they died almost the same year.
Okay, well, that's a good point, okay?
Okay,
Because he died in 1560?
Barbiere died in 1565 in Paris, and Michelangelo died
1564.
in 1564. So a year apart. Mm-hmm. So the question, yes.
So it was while he was alive.
Okay. How was that a question? I don't know why I asked that question.
Was he understanding Michelangelo as a person or what he was? Yeah.
And the non-finito part.
Yeah.
The unfinished sculptures by Michelangelo, which to our modern eyes are so fantastic because the sculptures are emerging from stone.
Which reminds us of Rodin.
Yes. Did he not finish them or did he leave them? Because
The answer's yes.
Because the non-finished thing is not a thing yet.
No, but it was to him. He did feel it. Michelangelo, was freeing the figures from their stony encasement. And, there are 4 figures that are in the Boboli Gardens, which I have yet to see, that are unfinished, but they are finished, Mm-hmm. I think somehow this gives us a closer sense of that.
But we think Barbiere intuited that?
I can't tell you that. I'd like to know more.
I would too.
This is probably why this whole concept of let's do reproductive print totally made me like, because it's just, there's too much and I want to know all of it and I can't and it'll be bad.
You just have to let some things go.
Right. And so we have to think about how these Italian artists were called up north to be making prints. We'll talk about this one in a moment. But how Holtz refers to it, that there was this Italomania that absolutely swept all of Europe. And, there would be those that would say it was the reproductive print was particularly the problem that kind of squashed engraving, because the engraving was the way to make reproductive prints. Etching hadn't been invented yet. We're not doing woodcuts. The Italians weren't that cool on woodcuts at all. I mean, if they did them for chiaroscuro woodcuts, or maybe if you're a Titian, it's like the Red Sea consuming Pharaoh's army. But they're massive things that could only be done on a huge scale. But this mania for things Italian sweeps the north. Well, that makes some sense too, because the semi-permeable membrane of the Alps has now been eroded, because these pieces of paper can go right up over the Alps. They can travel, they can get around. And I wanted to remind Anna one other thing that we didn't get to show very often. I always wanted to see them, but Giorgio Ghisi had also done these spandrels with each of the prophets from the Sistine ceiling, and they're good size. Each of them was like 22 by 16 inches, and I think there were like 13 of them. And sometimes they would even print them on silk that could be hung up in the person's home. So because you could actually start decorating your home, like, I've got some Michelangelo here. Come see my spandrels. It's really something to realize that it wasn't just the small print that lives in a little drawer someplace, or, hey, come up and look at my etchings. It's the kind of thing that could have been glued to a wall that we may have lost. So, think about how many Albrecht Dürer triumphal arches there must have been out there when they, slapped them on the city wall to say, hey, Maximilian's here too. Right. When I talk about the sack of Rome, I also have to remind the students it was two blasts that hit Catholicism. The second one was the sack of Rome. The first one came in 1517. On October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther pounds his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church with his arguments about what the Catholic Church is doing wrong. And ultimately, that, as I believe we've spoken at length about that, about how that splits Christendom.
Some of our most popular episodes.
So, Martin Luther pounds his theses to the wall. So imagine that hitting Rome and the after effects of that. I like to think about the Reformation and what it does as shaking the foundations of what had been set forth in Italy. So the day I put these three together, I was really quite pleased. When we think about the Renaissance, the stability and the nobility of it, and the beauty, the triangular sense of the mother and the child, and you look at how stable a Leonardo, a virgin and child and her mom, or the Pietà, or the Raphael, they're so triangular, stable, primary colors, beautifully drawn. But the concept of the tumult that came about after the sack of Rome, you can see that ravage artwork. That is Pontormo's Deposition from the Cross, which was painted about 1527 in that area. And I want you to notice that in Florence. It's in Florence.
He's in Florence.
Mm-hmm. In fact, I paid money to go in there and have the lights turn on for 15 seconds. I actually did a print after this with John Lennon in it.
You did?
Yeah. So I'm comparing this Deposition from the Cross to Michelangelo's Pietà. And mannerism is the movement that some people call it late high Renaissance. I don't think it's the same creature. I think it's a response to something very big that happened. And the Mannerist artists did do things in the manner of Leonardo and Raphael and Michelangelo. But they also went their own way, and you'll see this kind of pantomime dance and this agonized expressions and the dizziness and the instability is one of the hallmarks of Mannerism. So I am comparing these two images on purpose so Anne could tell you, are you noticing any comparable thing from Michelangelo's Pietà to this particular painting of the removal of Christ from the cross?
Well, the thing that's most obvious to me is the positioning of Christ.
Yep.
Because the deposition, he's being lifted down by, one angel has him under the shoulders and one has him under the knees, and he's kneeling down. So he's draped on the two of them, just like he's draped over Mary's lap.
And yet Mary now is like, fading backwards and like, she's melting away. And the part I also think is just fascinating. This person can be like, "Oh, Mary, here, let me dab your brow with my little cloth," and they're looking so worried, and they removed him from the cross, but where's the cross?
Yeah.
Where are the halos?
It's bizarre.
There aren't any, and it almost looks like they're kind of almost standing on a hill. How can any of this 250-pound Christ be supported on these teeny-weeny little feet?
Right.
But you look at all of the beautiful angles of the bodies here, and the hands and the feet and the heads and the faces, and all of that is one of the things the Mannerist artists love to pay attention to.
Who's that on the far right? Looks like she has a black bonnet on.
That one, that's Nicodemus. He donated the tomb.
He?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's not reading like
a little bit androgyne here. So, but wait, what? There you go. Do you see it? So, thank you. So the idea is, but the Laocoon and all of that kind of emotion is what really comes out in these Mannerist artworks.
Okay, so just for everybody, truth is now flashing before me, the deposition by Pontormo across from the Laocoon, the sculpture itself. And the figure of Christ is not as twisted, but is as twisted as the
Laocoon, and the brothers, all of this activity, the snaking through it, the wandering of this whipping action, and the fact that it literally spins.
So Mannerism possibly doesn't happen unless the Laocoon is uncovered.
I think that has to be a huge part of it.
Yeah. It's incredible that one sculpture could have that much effect.
Well, it certainly opens a door, and then if you started, okay, well, here. I love doing that too. So now I'm comparing a Raphael to a Parmigianino, the Madonna of the long neck, the one who has like 13 vertebrae, too many in her neck. The face has still got that Raphael lovely lidded appearance. But what is the stability of this triangular composition of Mary, helping, baby Jesus say hello to little infant John the Baptist? Let's take a look at this. Madonna, and why don't you give me a little chit chat about what's happening there?
Well, aside from the fact that the proportions are all wrong, the baby Jesus, it looks A, dead, and B, looks like he's sliding right off her lap.
And C, like kind of an alien too.
He does look a bit like an alien.
He's one of those really terrifying infants that's way too big.
Remember that baby, the first animated baby that would dance in your computer? That was so bizarre. That's what that
it's that terrifying kind of child. Plus, and so this Mannerist fashion for hands and feet. I always talk to my Peabody students about looking at the hand on her chest. I think she can play a 14th. Most people can play an octave maybe on the piano, but she could really do stride piano with great ease. And you notice that all of the figures that are all coming to worship are all crammed onto the one side, and on the other side you have this peculiar alley of phalluses, columns going back into nowhere with these tiny little shadows that make no sense, and a little tiny little Isaiah back to me, hey, someday a Christ child will come. It is confusing, and the Madonna of the long neck. Why, look at her beautiful bodice.
Mm-hmm. Ew.
Oh, see, Anne's not real keen on the way the nipple is poking through that fabric.
And her belly button.
But
very sexual.
But if we were to look at the way the band across her figure replicates almost exactly.
Wait, we're back on the Michelangelo Pietà. She's got a thing crossing between her boobs.
Yep, the sash replicates that. However, it's now this wet T-shirt kind of thing like you would see on the Nike of Samothrace. It's all. Yeah, and wait, but this is all, where's the halo?
Well,
it's almost, to me.
Does she need it?
Even Raphael puts a little, but the thing is, and I don't think he forgot it, I just always have a feeling that it feels like the soul has dropped out of these images, as though everything is in complete turmoil at this time. In these years following the sack of Rome, the stability of the Christian church, the faith of what's okay, what you have are wealthy people that still want paintings. The church isn't in a position to be commissioning big projects. The church has to get its shit together. And they end up figuring out what they will eventually will call the Catholic Counter-Reformation. But that's all done by a gathering of forces together saying, we will root out the heretics who are going to take us down. And that also establishes you didn't expect the Spanish Inquisition. And so how do you get that back? Well, the idea of reproducing something, I throw this in because it makes me laugh.
It is funny.
It
Can
is.
we describe it for the people at
Why
home?
don't you?
Okay. On the screen right now is, on your left is the statue of David by Michelangelo. And on the right is a picture of Drew in like a garden statuary store fingering a David.
I'm not fingering. We were cruising down the Autobahn, the highway in Italy, and it was like Carrara marble things. And I stop the car. We stop the car. I jump out, and these are all cast. Little marble dust cast. You could get a lawn David. You could get a lawn
Botticelli.
correct Botticelli Venus. You could get a little Venus de Milo. But the idea of
They're not that little. They're like 2.5 feet tall.
well, yeah, they go up to my waist. But
Right.
look at them all. But the idea of imitation is the greatest form of.
Flattery.
And how do you get the idea out? I just love the fact that this replication of images is so important, and that's what Michelangelo had been doing. Raphael for sure. But this is the concept of the reproductive print, just the lawn sculptures. Some people do it with gnomes now. I would certainly do a lawn David. But the idea of prints spreading that concept of mannerism and this new sense of the torque of the figure and these crazy expressions and gestures. Even look at the difference here. You can see that this artist has used this same exact arm from Michelangelo's David with a prophet, but then it gets these mannerist proportions that are really kind of confusing.
They're really super confusing. So on the screen, Michelangelo's David is on the left, and Becca Fumi's print of a prophet, which has a pose that's quite similar to David's in one respect. Mm-hmm. Although he's all clothed in his drapes and stuff.
But he's still got that.
And he's got a lectern. What is that?
It's a book, maybe.
How can he's not holding it?
Well, it's the Mannerist era, so there's a lot of confusion in the Mannerist era. I know, but they're kind of wonderful. Heads, hands, and feet. But that idea of
okay, now we've got
extracting and pastiching things to.
Moses in the middle.
There you go. And now, but see, this plus this equals that, right?
I see.
And this is a chiaroscuro woodcut but you can see that they're channeling. Ooh, I want a little bit of Michelangelo here. I want a little of this here, and they're putting them all together. And so this concept of the Mannerist art form really spreads widely. And I used to think, why in hell would it do that? These tiny little heads, and these elongated bodies, and these elegant hands and feet in peculiar positions. But it's because in part it's fashion, in part it's because of this Italomania of images that are flooding over the Alps and across all of Europe. Here we have, again, the two Parmigianinos that we discussed before, that gorgeous chiaroscuro woodcut of Diogenes, done by the same artist that did the terrifying Madonna, the long neck. Parmigianino knew how to get his market out there. He knew to have things done in woodcut. He knew to have things done.
He knew his anatomy better than he's showing in the Madonna the long.
That's
the thing. Like it's on purpose.
Oh, hell yeah. It's not
just
no.
Not a good artist.
Oh no. Remember, the buyer is always right. So what noble wants this for their home, they're going to get what they want.
Oh, weird.
So the concept of the chiaroscuro woodcut is a way to get the idea out there in one mode. Do you want it in color or do you want it in black and white? Then let's give it to them in engraving. We've talked about how that can address two different audiences and how it also still quotes Michelangelo's Ignudi from the ceiling of the Sistine.
Oh, I've forgotten that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's all of this is like channeling, and remembering too that Michelangelo is still very much alive at this time. I mean, Parmigianino, was working that concept of the chiaroscuro woodcut. This Italian preference for disegno and drawing, always important. So understanding that it could be the same damn image of a martyrdom of St. Peter and Paul could be done either in chiaroscuro woodcut, if that's how you want it, or you could get it in an engraved version.
But not in concert necessarily. So Antonio da Trento's Martyrdom of Saints Peter and Paul from circa 1525 is a chiaroscuro woodcut, and from somewhere close in time is another one, an engraving by Coralio, same composition. But I mean, the print seller in front of San Marco wasn't standing there going, "Do you want it in woodcut or do you want it in engraving?" Correct.
I think the print dealers and the print houses have much more control than they would have before. And I think so much of it...
Starting to be an actual...
Trade.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And the artists recognize that. I mean, Parmigianino knew how to market himself. I mean, he didn't live terribly long, but he...
No, he didn't. He was born in 1503 and died in 1540.
37 is not a too good a run, Him and Mozart, Caravaggio, how much can you get done in 37 or 39 years?
A lot for some of them.
Well, look, I guess I better get busy. I'm feeling real lazy right now.
Right?
but the intensity of these is so different. Obviously, I'm going to prefer the chiaroscuro woodcut.
Well, you're a woodcutter. But you're awesome.
But look, come on, look at these figures. There's like so much more drama and the roiling of it.
But don't you think also that the engravings are starting to get that staid look?
Yeah, and that's where, thank you, this is where Holtz could start saying that it's a problem and that things got really stiff, and this is where engraving lost all of its speed. It's too bad that that's how that goes down.
Well, this is a great illustration to set the tone for what comes next.
So that idea of carrying things northward, so let's go back to Giorgio Ghisi for a moment. We had spoken about Giorgio Ghisi and how he'd been hired up to go to the Four Winds and
to work for our favorite Hieronymus Cock.
Good job, Ann. And how he has now adapted a Raphael.
This is the School of Athens.
Yes, and then you can see that you've got Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael all pictured in it. But the idea that he's going up there and that he schools an entire generation of artists who... Giorgio Ghisi, but also is making, his own changes to the image, because as we know, the School of Athens is a lunette, it's a semicircular painting.
But it's big and on the wall. I mean, it's not like the size of Starry Night.
Correct. And so you have, how is this artist going to solve the problem of a copper plate, something that can be sold, something that can be carried, something that can be put on a wall, and how does he alter the composition so that it makes sense? I still kind of wonder if he couldn't have done just a little zhuzh back there behind him, but that's me. But we also have to see that Giorgio Ghisi was clever enough to emulate not just the high Renaissance of Raphael, but he also is giving us the Mannerist kinds of images that we would come to expect mid-century, later in the century, because we've looked at this before. But now, how mannered is this figure of Hercules victorious over the Lernaean Hydra?
Okay, this is Giorgio Ghisi after Bertani. Hercules victorious over the Lernaean Hydra.
One of his 12 labors.
Circa 1558.
58. And it's a good-sized print, 14, 18 and a half. Now, Ghisi, we know he can be a reproductive printmaker, right? Yeah. He can do this guy, he can do that guy. And boy, is he doing a Bertani job here. It's
a pretty great print.
It's a fabulous print, but it's wildly Mannerist with all of these attendant, there's every aspect of learning in there. It's not just about the multi-breasted Hydra that's been beheaded by Hercules, which is quite remarkable with all of its boobies. There are many.
There are.
Yeah, and very nipply. And the claw that it protrudes out. But looking at the Herculean figure, Anne, does it seem mannered to you?
Yeah, I mean, the torso looks particularly strange and long. Yeah, things don't quite work right, and his head's tiny, and his legs are too big. His contrapposto is like super souped-up contrapposto.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there are even little muscles in his groin that I don't know any of us would ever find.
Right.
But
it's
weenie. Piccolo. But the idea of spreading this appearance of the Mannerist, I mean, you have to give it to the reproductive printmakers. That's how Mannerism gets out there.
Right.
At the same time, it's not the only thing that's out there. I just wanted to take a quick look at our artists in the north, like the Bayhams. We talked about them briefly, too.
So sorry, people. That's where we're going to cut it off. We talked for another hour plus, and that will be our fourth part of reproductive prints. So stay tuned for that the next time. It just seemed like an appropriate place to stop as we were turning toward the north. So thank you to True for being the SME on the history of prints, the subject matter expert. Nobody does it better. I continue to marvel at the brain that is the True. I have to thank, as always, Michael Diamond for the use of his original music, and a reminder to you that any images we talk about are over on the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com. There's also a support and donate button over there. Click that and you'll help me keep the lights on here at Platemark. It's just me. Okay, I think that's it. We will see you next time.